So I would like to welcome everyone to this session on diversity and inclusion, why and how. In this talk I want to give you actually multiple reasons why, and I also want to give you some very concrete ways how you can maybe be very actionable in actually doing something about diversity and inclusion. Let me start off. I want to play a little video. Let's see if I can actually do this. Okay. So now, some of you have maybe seen this video before. So we can see here a soap dispenser. First there was someone with a white complexion holding a hand under the soap dispenser and they got soap. Now we have somebody with a dark complexion and they're not getting any soap. And one of the things that they say during this video was too black. And then this person with a white, black complexion then shows the life hack of basically taking the black complexion to get soap. Right? And again, it just doesn't work with a dark complexion. And so what I find very interesting about this thing is that I don't think that the creators of this soap dispensers are racist, but they created a machine that is racist, right? And I think many of us, when we do things that are offensive, we say, okay, this was just an accident, right? We come up with excuses. More importantly, like, how dare you suggest that I'm racist, sexist, or any of that thing, right? We get defensive and we turn the offense around. Suddenly we're the offended person, right? The reality is, of course, that the engineers didn't think of skin complexion in this, right? So I think they did a pretty bad job at engineering this, right? They didn't think of all their users. And maybe they thought they didn't because maybe none of the engineers on their team, most likely, they didn't have a single black person test this thing, and most likely they didn't have a single black person on their team, and maybe they just didn't have diversity at all on their team, so they didn't even consider to think about that something could not work if it works for them. Right? So again, how should they react in that situation? And I think this is something that many people that are from well-represented groups, they tend to become defensive in those moments. And I think this is something that we really have to work on. And we should just listen, fix the issue, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And it is like, for example, there are some people that don't go by he, she for pronouns, right? And you might learn about this. You might screw up when you're using they for a singular, right? It's fine. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just correct yourself. Keep moving on, right? And this is something, a mentality, that I hope that some of you might take away from this talk. So, what I also want to highlight is that, well, you might think that, these accidents, other people make them, but I take care of these things. So I come from the Symfony community, and I recently was appointed lead of the Diversity Initiative, and mostly because I have a position of privilege. I'm part of the core team, and so a lot of people look up to me, and so it was decided that I would be a good person to lead this. Also, I wanted to do it, but I'm not an expert. So another example of a non-expert leading something, simply because they're in a position of privilege. But anyway, so I take over this role in the Symfony community, and so what you see on the left here, hey dude, this is a badge that we give everyone that signs up, or we gave everyone when they signed up for Symfony Connect, which is a requirement to go to a conference, which is a requirement to comment, right? This has been there for years. And so I sit at the award ceremony, and I don't know, for some reason I stumbled about this, because we also, I think we had an award. Yeah, we had an award that was thanks dude, right? And I stumbled this and I said, what? And we fixed it within a week, like we updated the badge and everything like that. But again, like this is something that we've been doing for years, right? And it's so blatantly, obviously wrong. And it was really easy to fix, but just because I got this role, I started to look like that. I put that hat on to look for something like this, right? So I think that was a very powerful moment for me to realize that, you know, being just a nice person that doesn't educate themselves, that doesn't look for this sort of thing, I'm actually part of the problem, right? It's not just that I'm not making it better, I'm part of making everything worse. So, yeah, I really want to bring that home. Somebody criticizes you for having done something offensive, don't become defensive, listen and learn. And again, I also want to emphasize is that we don't know all the cultures in the world, right? So we may do something that is offensive in one culture, we don't know about it, and it's probably not realistic to know everything. But then just accept the fact that for that person, that was offensive, right? And that is a fact. For that person, it was offensive. Don't try to minimize that. Just listen, learn, move on. Try to behave different next time you encounter that person. So I brought this up already. So I always thought I was a nice person. I'm not part of the problem. And then my partner, she's an engineer, and she started to expose me to her daily realities. And I thought it was bad, but then I noticed it was much worse. And that kind of made me sort of understand that there's a sense of urgency here that I didn't understand. That it's not enough to wait for, you know, everybody to become a nice guy, and then everything will be fine. That I had to become active. And this is really my goal also with this talk. I really want to shine a light on this, and I want to create a sense of urgency within all of you that this is an important topic to educate yourself on. So I'm going to give a couple definitions just maybe to help you navigate this topic. Again, the sense of urgency is the key thing. If you take any of these definitions, and that's great, but not so important. So diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting. Gender is one of the dimensions that is being talked about most, and this is kind of because 50% of the world is directly affected. There are no socioeconomic excuses that we can come up with why things are the way they are. Like there's a 50% chance that your child will be a boy or a girl, or somewhere on that dimension. So that's one of the reasons why gender gets talked a lot. But all the other dimensions, every dimension, is just as important. Age, education, sexual orientation, disabilities, and so on. One more example I want to give. So Apple created this, what they call an intimate device, which is a very comprehensive health device, in fact. So that's how Tim Cook promoted this. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the oldest form of health tracking in mankind is tracking the menstrual cycle. In fact, it predates the calendar. It doesn't require any fancy sensors beyond the timekeeping that is already in a watch, right? So they prefer to cover, you know, all the things except for menstrual cycles, right? They don't cover that in the first release. Very trivial challenge, very trivial challenge to deal with for the software company, right? So Watch Series 2, they didn't finally add that feature, and so the demographics of buying, they changed from 20% to 26%. This graphic I got from an article in that article, the topic that menstrual cycle tracking was added in between that time was not a topic. To them it was a mystery how such a change in demographic can come about. Again, I don't have final proof that this is related to that, but I think that there's at least a reasonable thing to bring up as possible correlation. So, in that sense, obviously, Apple was losing business, so it's bad business to not think, because I think it's a trivial problem. They could have done it, and they could have gotten more watches sold. Inclusion, this is actually the more important term over diversity, because diversity is basically, we just make sure we have enough of everyone in the room, but we don't allow them to say anything. So inclusion is that part, where you actually want to hear what they say, right? You want to benefit from them being in the room. So diversity without inclusion is useless. You can look at it a little bit like diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So really you're participating. The dance routine just got more interesting because you got a couple more dance moves, right? Privilege, and this one is a very loaded term, or at least people have made it loaded. I don't think it's very loaded. So privilege is basically an advantage that you have that is completely out of your control. You did nothing to get that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, you don't have to apologize for it, but it's also don't pretend like you did anything for it. So, for me personally maybe, so the visibility I got out of being in the open source community, I get to do a keynote like this, right? I have, my career, I did a university degree, but open source has been a key thing in my career. Now, I started my own company doing open source stuff. This is how I got into it. But the capital I earned by working for my uncle in the summer here in Switzerland while I was working in Berlin, so I made nice amount of money from that. I also didn't really have to worry about if my company worked out or not because my parents were subsidizing my apartment. If we would have gone bust as a company, they would have been there to take care of me, right? So the only reason why I got to this very privileged position in the open source community is the socioeconomic strength of my parents that they had for me. So that means, maybe to drive this home, it doesn't diminish what I've done in the open source community. I can still be proud of that, but I have to acknowledge that there are plenty of people that had the same potential and was never realized, simply because they didn't have that socioeconomic strength behind them. Another, and brings me to a topic of equity. So if this potential, this sleeping potential, is not realized, maybe we should start to think towards equity to try to create this fairness by basically giving people the opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. So just some thought experience, or just think of the numbers. So roughly, how many percentage of programmers in Switzerland are female? Let's say in the proprietary world. So think of a number, 15%, right? What about the US? Think of a number, worse, better? Better. That's surprising. But let's think about open source. Right? And I guess I said that during the panel discussion, so it's here, you all know that it actually is worse, much worse. Horribly worse, right? And we're the open people, right? And we're not inclusive at all. And
to be fair, in the Drupal project, it's 17%.
Okay, great. So 70% is good?
17.
Okay, but still not perfect, right? We need to get better, but this is awesome, right? And I've noticed this. This has been noticeable to me. And I think this number is also great because there's a certain threshold that you need to reach before somebody doesn't feel like a unicorn by definition, right? And I think Drupal is getting to that point where you can be a woman and you don't feel like a unicorn within this community. So this is great. But for example, in terms of equity, and I was chatting to some people at Leap, we have a tradition of hiring open source developers. So our method of hiring is actually not diverse. We are intentionally looking at a pool that is not diverse, and we're preferring it over a pool that is more diverse. So at my company, we need to do better. We need to think about this. We need to do more. Now, another thing that is super shocking, so there was a study that discovered that actually a lot of women, when they contribute to open source, they use male-sounding names because it increases their likelihood of getting the code accepted. But if you look at the average acceptance rate of women, it's actually a little bit higher than men. So their contribution or at least as good as men's, but they have to use women's names to actually get them approved. And we're doing meritocracy, right? It's not about managers or something like that. We're just looking at the merit, and we feel we can really judge the merit. But when we see a woman's name, we're going to judge it differently currently, right? So equity, when we see things like a boot camp for women to become speakers and things like that, and I launched some of these things. The first reaction: why are we excluding the poor white men that have also some issues with? And I would say, yeah, if you came from a single parent family and you didn't have the opportunity in education, I think you should get support as well, right? But don't do the whataboutism thing that because we're doing this thing for women here, we're doing this thing for accessibility there, that somehow this is creating injustice. This is just trying to create equity. Last definition I want to get at is conscious bias, and I think I have to go faster because I'm way too back of time. So quickly, cognitive bias are one of the key issues with diversity. So these are mental shortcuts that in the past, when we were still hunting and things like that, they were great. They helped create a level of comfort and efficiency, right? But nowadays, we don't need to hunt for a deer every day. We're looking for the mammoth once every 5 years. We want big innovation, right? And we don't need that level of comfort that we get from cognitive bias. We actually want some level of discomfort in the sense that we get challenged every day by different thoughts, right? And cognitive bias help protect us against diversity, right? So by cognitive bias, we push out diversity. We want to find people that think like us, right? And we say, well, I think I'm a pretty good developer, so I'm looking for another person just like me. But I just had, actually in the rent channel on our company, somebody was complaining that they wrote something in 1 hour and had 7 hours of code fixing from the review process. They were annoyed by that. But imagine they wouldn't have gotten any feedback. They apparently would have committed bad code and be happy about it, right? So we need this thing. And cognitive bias, there are quite a lot of, and they're basically past experience that get extrapolated in a way that lead us to, on average, make actually bad decisions. So the interesting thing is that the more you increase diversity, the more you inoculate yourself against cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are holding us back from innovation. Therefore, I would argue a more diverse company is better at innovation. Right? It might be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, right? Because you need to deal with these different thoughts and things like that. But this is what makes you more innovative. So how to improve? And I have to go a lot faster. I will go really fast. Try to remember 1, if you're really, really motivated, 2 things that you are going to try to implement. First thing, educate yourself on the topic. You just started here, great, continue. Next thing, following people from marginalized communities so you can understand the challenges that they're dealing with and you can become a better ally. When you see somebody on Twitter that said one interesting thing and they're from a marginalized community, follow them. Don't wait until you see them 5 times. Challenge your cognitive bias. There's cognitive bias trainings, seek them out. When you hear something from somebody from a marginalized community, tend to believe them. Just because you didn't hear it often is probably because they're marginalized. They're not representative fully yet. Ask yourself what new skills and ideas somebody that you're hiring to your team brings, rather than asking how you will then get to go along with them when drinking a beer. Leave out optional items from job ads because they, on average, tend to push out people from marginalized communities because they said my chances are low anyway. If I don't cover the optional stuff, I will never get hired. Review the language in job ads at your company. Make that a thing. Work on your inclusive language, and I still have a long way to go, but for example, I try, when the gender doesn't matter, I try to choose words that are non-gender. And some languages are easier and some languages are harder at this. I recently did this. I added my preferred pronouns in every place, and there are he, his, right? So kind of what the norm is, right? But by doing that, I normalize this for everyone so that it becomes normal to specifically be able to be empowered to choose your pronouns, Throttle yourself in discussion. I'm a very loud, well, maybe not in decibel sense, but I take a lot of space. I have a lot of opinions. I really work hard on this. I need to get better at this, throttling myself in discussions to take less space. And again, the key thing, don't get defensive, listen, learn, move on. And also, this is a big thing, people from marginalized communities tend to get overlooked for their contributions. Point them out, highlight them, don't make them be the ones to point it out. You do this for them. And live by the mantra, safe enough to try. If we want to gain from diversity, we need to accept that people do things differently, and we need to see that as an opportunity and not immediately question why they're doing it differently. So key takeaways, diversity helps understanding your customers because your customers are diverse. Cognitive bias hurt innovation. Diversity helps overcome those cognitive bias. Listen, learn, move on. There are things you can do, but it requires effort, and don't expect this to be about your personal comfort zone. This is sometimes even uncomfortable. So thank you very much. And actually I forgot to move that line because I actually did a variation of this talk internally at my company, so we have a diversity channel. I don't know, I assume there are similar channels or places in the Drupal community, and I hope people will point them out via Twitter afterwards. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So we are now switching over to the closing. And while we do that, I wanted to share some thought, because